These are opening stages of what will be a broad and concerted campaign.
Here comes your guardian policeman.
Please do not shoot me. Then listen to my instructions. I'm trying to do it. Don't talk! Listen!
How can you be certain that all of the people killed pose an imminent threat to the United States?
There's no doubt that civilians were killed that shouldn't have been.
Welcome to The Breakdown with Birkenhoff. In today's video is an analysis piece of the documentary The Monopoly on Violence by Stateless Productions. And as I just said, this is going to be more of an analysis piece of that documentary. But in order to understand the documentary of The Monopoly on Violence, we need to be able to discuss what a documentary is and what the purpose of documentaries have, and therefore we can understand what the purpose of The Monopoly on Violence documentary is as well. But if you don't want to hear the kind of introduction to the actual analysis piece, I will have a timestamp showing on the screen now or in my channel description below, and you can skip right to the analysis of The Monopoly on Violence. That being said, it's very important to be able to get context on everything just so you can understand where I come from when I analyze The Monopoly on Violence and what I try to understand with everything it shows in the actual documentary. But just before we dive into any of the analysis itself, all of the information, articles, videos, and information I gained in my research will be linked in my channel description if you want to check it out yourself, including the actual movie itself, which is on YouTube, and I believe they're trying to get it on Amazon and Netflix shortly as well. And by the time you might be hearing this, they could already be on those platforms. So let's get right into this issue, and let's first define what a documentary is with some details. A film, as defined, is a motion picture that shapes and interprets factual material for purposes of education or entertainment. Documentaries have been made in one form or another for nearly every country and have contributed significantly to the development of realism in films. But it doesn't really tell us too much about how I wanted to define the term documentary, and I think that is best said by the newbieschoolfilm.com, and they state that documentaries are non-fiction movies that strive towards the betterment of the world. Its purpose is to make you aware and actively participate in a society that can shape the future of the world. So now that we know kind of two different terms of what a documentary is defined as, we then need to go on to really the main focus of a documentary, and that is the purpose of the documentary. And they also define purpose as being to inform, to attack a perspective, to persuade, to educate, to entertain, or to defend a perspective, and even to critique and observe life, as you can kind of see with nature documentaries for the last one, but we'll talk about that a little bit later on. But now that we know that about how a documentary is defined and some sort of purposes you could see in the documentary, there are several different ways of how documentaries are formatted, and really there are 6 different type of documentary formats. Some people say there's some people say there's 4, some people say there's more than 6. It just depends on where you really look, but these are the main ones you kind of see when you do research on the types of documentaries or the formats of documentaries. And those are poetic mode, expository mode, participatory mode, observational mode, reflexive mode, perminative mode, and a very brief summary of the difference of each of the narrative styles. So in other words, each one of those different types of formats the documentary has, really it just depends on how the narration is done in each of those types. So in other words, in a certain mode of observational mode, you might have an omniscient narrator, where the narrator knows everything, while in another type of documentary format, the narrator isn't really very much present in the actual film, the documentary. So there are just different types of formats or styles you could see in a documentary. But you can do an entire episode just on those formats and how you can use those formats, the pros and cons of each, and blah blah blah. You can have an entire video just on that concept, and I don't really want that to be too focused on this particular video, since the main purpose is an analysis piece and not a discussion of types of documentaries. But I thought I at least needed to make you aware that there are several different types of formats a documentary can also take within its very simple definition that we started this video out with. But now we're going to focus on the main perspective of what I want you to take away with this part of the analysis, and that is the purpose of the documentary, because the documentary maker wants you to come away thinking something, and what they want you to come away thinking ultimately defines what type of documentary it is. Documentary is what the viewer goes away thinking. You really have 2 main types of purposes when we go in to watch a documentary. You have the purpose of trying to learn a new idea or a tool or a concept, and then you have the idea of exposing what's wrong in society or what's happening in evil politics, evil countries, blah blah blah. You have those two main purposes of their ideas. So knowing that we have those two main purposes, we could then discuss what the filmmaker wants you to go away with. And I have two examples of both of those different types that we will very briefly cover over. The first type is like a BBC nature documentary or Planet Earth, where they're simply introducing you to life or to a new species of life, or maybe further explanation of what a fish does in nature, or what polar bears do because of global warming. They might introduce political concepts because ice is melting or whatever their reason might particularly be, but their main purpose of that documentary is to show the physical creature that they're implementing in their documentary and for you to learn more about it. While the second type is more of a type that wants to spark movement, wants to spark action for you by watching a documentary. And the biggest or the primest example I could think of when it comes to this type of documentary is the documentary Super Size Me. Anybody my age, maybe a little bit older, had to watch this movie Super Size Me in high school. It was almost a requirement for any sort of health class you might have been in. And the main purpose of Super Size Me was Morgan trying to expose himself to a very unhealthy diet through just eating McDonald's and showing how much of progression and body fat and just how bad these companies are with their Super Size Me practices, where they're just willing to give you so many extra calories just because they'll keep getting you back, and because people are addicted to eating this mass amount of foods. And his whole purpose was trying to expose just how unhealthy and how bad the fast food industry is, and that was to spark movement. So those are really the main two purposes of the documentary, and I didn't want to drag this video out too long in actual background information before you get into the main purpose of the video. So this is where I'm going to end now before we start talking about the actual main topic of this video. So now that we know the main two concepts of a documentary, or the main two purpose or go-aways about the documentary, we can now approach the monopoly on violence with a bit more understanding of what a documentary is, and what motivation or what purpose or what takeaway the monopoly on violence is wanting you to take after watching their film. So let's dive right into this, and we'll get into the actual coverage of the monopoly on violence. Monopoly on Violence documentary was really twofold in its purpose. It was first to teach you, and then second was to give you to spark action on what they had previously just taught you. But I do think the best purpose was best told by one of the main producers and makers of this documentary, through Pete Canoas.
Introducing the public to what anarchy is. And unfortunately, at this time, most of the public believes that anarchy is going around and breaking windows and robbing and looting places and beating people up. And it's not. So we just wanted to present to them that there are people out here who believe in non-aggression. There are people out here who believe in free markets and believe in just voluntary transactions, that believe that the state is obsolete, it's force, it's violence, and that there's a better way. And that's what the goal of this is.
So as we heard it there from Pete himself, the main focus of their documentary was one, to introduce anarchy, the concept of anarchy, to everyone, and two, to show you why anarchy may be one of the only solutions we could use to make a better America as we know it today. But in order for my analysis of the monopoly of violence to make the most sense, I'm going to have anarchy, the concept itself, covered later on in my analysis piece. And we're first going to cover over the state, because the documentary does a very good job of teaching you what the state is and why the state is so bad. And really, I think it's very important to learn how the documentary defines the state with some other further examples that I found before we can get into the concept of anarchy and why it may be a solution. So we are first going to cover the state, but we are definitely not going to forget the anarchy angle to the documentary itself as well, because really, it is the main focus and the main takeaway the monopoly of violence wants you to go away with. But before I keep blabbering on too much about extra information you don't really need to know, let's get right into the state and how the state is defined by the documentary with some other examples. This role is huge and all over because it is America. The United States of America is the state. And if you want to be the most simplistic viewpoint of what the state is, it is the government and how the government works in America as of right now. And because we are all living together under one United States of America and under one state, it's hard for the general public to agree on a lot of things. And we see mass divide with a whole lot of recent issues, such as police brutality, government usage and control, government usage of money, government usage of blah, blah, blah. You can go on and on and on. And there is many factors that divide the nation because we are under one United States of America. So once again, we're going to ask Pete to define his definition of what the state is and their role.
Together to create an organization where they were immune from actions that they took, whether that be stealing, whether that be conducting business on an international basis, whether that be trying to control our behavior.
So obviously he disapproves of the state and sees the role of the state as bad and evil, but it ultimately comes down to how the government wants to control its citizenry. And the most clearest example of how the government is able to do that is by creating political ideologies. They're able to get people fully believing into their parties rather than believing into individual candidates through the Republican, through the Democrat, and so on. If you can get someone to fully have ownership within your party ideology, you can now control your citizenry much better. Even if the two separate political ideologies are far apart from each other, it's still a good way to keep the mass amount of your citizens in control over that part of the government and over that part of policies and so on. So if you have everyone believing into the political ideology, it's a good way to keep people down that line of where you want them to be. And we can also see that with the role of the state and its key understanding on how the documentary defines the state. And we'll go ahead and listen to
The state is a parasite class.
We once again hear from Pete as he defines the state as a very negative role once again, and he also goes as far as to describe the state as a parasite class of people that only see their interest in mind instead of the interest of their constituents or the interest of their people or people in general, because they only have their interest in mind. So now that we clearly know his motives and the documentary motives of how they describe the state, we can also see this here in the third clip.
This can't stand. It's not a civilization. People talk about how, we live in a society, we live in a civilization, taxes are the prices we pay to live in a civilized society. Well, you got over 2 million people in jail, and over half of them are in there for nonviolent crimes. So how is that civilization?
So this ultimately brings up the question, so if the documentary makes the state so hated, then why do people just seem to go along with it? And I think the major reason for this is people are either uneducated or believe in the party ideologies that the government has set up so well, as I briefly explained a little bit earlier. And one of the most easiest examples to point to of why government greed is so bad is the profit of wars, and that's why many government officials make money off of wars, and many government contractors make money off of wars, and that's why continuous wars and more wars in the first place get made to fulfill the pockets of many government officials. And we're going to look at a few of those examples today as well, and many articles that point to those being the fact. And just a quick note, the documentary did also mention this as a point, but I just wanted to expand on it a little more just so you can see just how bad it has become. First article is by the American Prospect, and it mentions the members of Congress who profit from war. And just a quick side note, any of these articles I'm going to show you on this topic or any other topics or research I've done for the documentary is linked in my channel description. So we'll go ahead and read some from this article because I think it's very important that many people become more aware just how bad Congress members and government in general profits from war. But we'll continue on here. When stock markets opened the next day, dozens of members of Congress saw bumps in their portfolios as their holdings in defense contractors like Lockheed Martin increased in value on the possibility of war. Over the next 3 trading days, the leading defense industry stock index would surge 2.4% above Thursday's close. According to a Sledge review of financial disclosures, 51 members of Congress and their spouses own between 2.3 and 5.8 million worth of stock in companies that are among the top 30 defense contractors in the world. Members of Congress generally report the values of their estimates in ranges, so it's not possible to know exactly how much their stocks are worth. 18 members of Congress combined own as much as $760,000 worth of stock of Lockheed Martin, the world's largest defense contractor in terms of overall defense revenues. And then you show here with the top contractors being Boeing, Honeywell, Lockheed Martin, United Technologies, and others. But we'll continue down a little bit more where we see a lot of disturbing sort of factors. Last week, the House of Representatives passed a resolution directing President Trump to terminate the use of the military to engage in hostilities in or against Iran unless Congress has authorized such action or to defend against an imminent threat. A similar resolution may be considered by the Senate this week. The House may vote for additional measures related to Iran, but the biggest thing here is the factor of how much money wives can make off of contracts. In other words, you have the issue of the senators or the representatives may know that they're about to go into a war, they're going to increase more planes or whatever the future might be, but they're not allowed to tell their wife or to tell somebody who is necessarily managing their money because that's insider trading and that's not allowed. But you see that in many cases continuing to happen, and we're going to read a little bit about that. Representative Kiana's wife, Riti Kiano, I hope I pronounced that right, owns as much as $376,000 in defense stocks. Kiana told Sludge in an email that he and his wife maintain independent finances and file taxes separately. And this is obviously a conflict of interest, as the article mentions here. More than 70% of Lockheed Martin's $51 billion in 2018 revenue came from sales to the U.S. government. For example, companies like Lockheed Martin, Northrop Grumman, and Raytheon are considered pure plays because they sell products almost exclusively to the government through operations approved by Congress. And you see here with the people who have the most amount of investments in the government with their stock markets, and these are all senators and big contractors such as Dianne Feinstein, Mitt Romney, Tom Carper, Rick Scott, Susan Collins, Roy Blunt, David Perdue, and many others are on that short list. So it is very disturbing. But you also have representatives that are also invested in top stocks, such as Steve Cohen, Rio Kiana, as we just heard, Phil Rowe, Fred Upton, Kevin Hearn, David Joyce, David Price, Kurt Schroeder, Mike Kelly, and many others, which is also rather disturbing. But one of the big things I wanted to mention also before we end here is with Dianne Feinstein, where she talked about some of her investments and serious conflicts of interest. A spokesperson for Feinstein, whose husband owns as much as $650,000 worth of Boeing stock, told the Sledge that the senator has no involvement in her husband's financial and business decisions, and that the senator's assets are in a blind trust, which has been the case since her arrival in the Senate. But once again, it goes back to the insider trading, and it is very easy to tell your financial planner or to tell your husband or whatever it might be to invest in these stocks without really anybody necessarily knowing that that is the case. And it is very concerning that the senators in this case even have an option to have stocks in these investments that could lead to more war and do lead to more war in a lot of cases. But this is just one of 3 examples that I'm going to be showing you. You might be wondering just how much percentage of congressmen or representatives go away profiting from war or profiting from these investments in these high stock owners of defense contractors. Well, most students would be happy with their test result. So as you can see here with this article, it states in its headline, Syria pro-war senators took 83% more money from the military industry. And we'll read on from the paragraphs here. Last week, the Senate Foreign Relations Committee voted 10-7 to approve the use of military force in Syria. A map-light analysis reveals that the senators voting yes received on average 83% more campaign money from defense contractors than senators voting no. These numbers are unwilling to a war-weary American public still licking its wounds from a $2 trillion 10-year in Iraq justified by lies about alleged weapons of mass destruction. The mere idea that politicians voting on matters of war and peace, life and death, could be influenced by contributions is most perverted money in politics nightmare. You can be sure that the senators voting yes in Syria imperfectly deny a quid pro quo with the military industry donors, saying that defense lobbyists give give them money because they happen to agree on military matters, and because everyone on the Foreign Relations Committee gets more money from these industries than just how the status quo is. And we could go on and look at some of these senators and pundits that also benefit from more, as you can see here from Mike.com, 10 politicians and pundits that would make big bucks from war with Syria. You have Senators Debbie Stimthal and Carl Levin. You have Stephen Headley. You have Senator Dick Durbin. You have Elizabeth O'Baggy. You have General Jack. You have Senator Tim Kaine. You have General Anthony Zinni. You have Senator Lindsey Graham. You have Senator John McCain. And those are others more on the list than just that. But those are just some people that they named off that have contracts or have done in the past with donating or having stocks within these military industry owners and whatnot. So these are obvious examples of people that are profiting from war when it's something that just shouldn't be happening. And it shows just how massive and just how egotistical government officials can be when only wanting to look at their interest and not the interest of the people in ongoing wars where many Americans choose to give their lives to when they really shouldn't have to. It's just a very hideous thing. So you might be wondering why so many people still like the state if there's just such obvious examples of the state doing bad when it should be doing good, or at least being more focused on themselves rather than the people and the constituents they should be focused on. And really, I think that is best said by Robert from the Generational Gap.
When it's all said and done, that is why I have started just making peace with the inevitable. A state is inevitable. It's necessary, and no matter how small you want to say your community is, and the community polices itself and governs itself, guess what? It's just going to be a small form of the state, because you're going to have to sacrifice certain liberties, you're going to have to sacrifice certain things, and you're going to have to abide by certain laws.
So if Robert is right, then it becomes, well, if you're someone who doesn't like the state, or someone wants to be more educated on the reason, or someone wants to hear the possibility of, if we go with America without a state, what does that look like? Well, then it becomes anarchy. But if you think of mass anarchy like a lot of people talk about, that's probably not going to realistically happen very well. So you want to approach anarchy in a slightly different way for most Americans to even want to try to attempt something like that. And that is where the documentary does a very good job at defining types of anarchy, which we are going to get to now. As I was saying before, a lot of people would struggle to familiarize themselves enough with anarchism, because anarchism is a very rough idea that a lot of Americans aren't really interested too much in or see a very realistic outcome of doing. And I do think that the Monopoly on Violence did a very good job at understanding that approach and introducing a type of anarchy or a type of anarchist system that they suggest for the United States in particular to potentially do. And I think the best way to start on anarchy and to get the perspective of how they kind of approached anarchy in the documentary is also listening to what Pete had to say on another podcast.
All faces of anarchism. So we're going to present every one that, we talk about Stirner, the egoist individual anarchism, and we talk about Kropotkin, hard left anarchism. Then we bring it up to Rothbard, and we concentrate more on anarcho-capitalism than anything else. But
the documentary is very fascinating defining their particular area of anarchy they want you to go away with, or the form of anarchy they particularly have an interest in or want you to have an interest in. So we'll go ahead and listen to that.
I think that by anarchist societies, and by anarchism in general, compared to its popular use as chaos, disorder, violence, and so on, the anarchism ought to be understood as forms of cooperation and mutuality without hierarchy.
He also goes on to define this term a lot more in anarchism and how they could see it particularly working within the United States. Because once again, not a lot of American citizens, if you just say the idea of panarchy or say the idea of anarchy, is going to 100% go along with it. And that brings me to the point of panarchy, which is I think their strongest example they used in the Monopoly on Violence to support a more anarchist approach. And this panarchy system was described by Max Powers, and I will do my best to summarize this concept to my best ability, but I highly suggest you at least watching this part of the documentary if this is something that interests you and you want more detail. But the whole idea is that you shouldn't have to vote just by your location. You should have the opportunity to vote for a certain healthcare system even if you don't particularly live in that area. But panarchy could also be explained to the much more extreme case, or to a case that could potentially work in the United States because of our political ideology. And what I mean by that is panarchy could also suggest half the country voting for Republicans and half the country voting for Democrats. So instead of doing that, you split off into 2 or 3 nations, and you get to have an opportunity to vote and to pass bills that you actually want to be passed within your constituency. Because the idea of Democrats and Republicans getting along and being able to vote on something that fits both their interests is so far gone and has rarely ever been seen to necessarily work. So it is an idea that could potentially be seen and working if more people feel that their government is failing at their jobs. But the only way a panarchist society or an anarchist society could work is if 2 things could happen. The first thing is if the people start getting mad at their government and go sort of towards a revolution or anything like that. So they're so mad at their government officials that they want to get rid of their government officials because they haven't done anything good. Or it's a bunch of people get together within their constituents, within individual people, and form communities and make governments by themselves without relying on the government themselves. But both of those ways really ultimately rely on the government, on people being able to change the government, and that's not necessarily the case. Because the most realistic way something like that could potentially happen is if it gets passed through the political system and through government, because the idea of having all these people join together and believe the same thing can happen, but it would have to happen at such a mass scale to be able to overturn how we see it in the United States right now. So the biggest idea about the idea of panarchy, or the idea of anarchism as a whole, is the idea of if enough people get together, what does that mean? Well, it could lead to secession, and there is many people that talk about secession within the monopoly on violence, but I do think it was best said by Ron Paul.
The whole thing is the principle of secession, I think, is very, very good. I sort of lean toward the nonviolent approach, but I always support secession. And I think that the founders made a mistake by not having that in the Constitution, because that would have restrained the government. If we could have, as individual states, leave the United States anytime we want, they would have been much more reserved in the abuse of the rights that the state should have and the rights of the individuals within the.
The idea of secession seems really smart, but the only way that would necessarily work is if really 2 outcomes, and I was explaining some of those outcomes as well, but another outcome you could potentially add, which is a little bit like a revolution, but also could necessarily be an implosion of the existing government itself, because it comes up not working, runs into problems, whatever the reasons might be, but an implosion could also be another factor. But the only way secession would necessarily work the most is if enough people get up to have more of a revolution, or more of a way to get into the government to be able to have a succession even happening. So the idea of the succession does seem practical in a lot of ways for more harsher anarchist type of approaches, but doesn't necessarily become that easy, because it still involves a very large outcome of happening in order for the result to change. And I think that is best said by Bob Murphy, blaming the repetitive cycle most Americans find themselves in. But this is really arguing over why the change won't happen. And he was arguing of why so many people don't necessarily want there to be change and want there to be an uprising, so to speak, or a different style of America like many anarchists want there to be. It's because people are unwilling necessarily to change, and they are okay with feeling like they need to be controlled by the state. Because many people, before a revolution or before an implosion of government even happens, first need to realize that the state is is controlling them and is bad that it's controlling them. Not just do they need to know that the government is controlling them, but they then need to realize how bad the government is in controlling them. Once that is realized, then the potential for a more anarchist society could be realized, because more people become aware of just how massive the government has become and just how flawed the voting styles have become, or just how flawed government is in the first place. So that's the only way that anarchy could potentially work the best. And another type could potentially be with market anarchism or market anarchy, where they simply suggest the idea of being able to have an entrepreneur and the idea of being able to fix roads would still happen because people will fulfill the gaps and fulfill the needs. Right now, governments and road building is made by contractors, but if there was a complete anarchist society, roads wouldn't just go down and go into full waste, because people would fulfill that gap and fulfill that opportunity, similar to like a contract, even though it wouldn't necessarily be a contract, but the need would still be fulfilled. And that can happen with any sort of product or any sort of innovation, because people will find a way to make money even if there isn't a government at all, but more just a communal living, similar to a complete anarchist approach or a complete communism type of approach, where everybody is under one umbrella, but there isn't necessarily one government that controls everything. And that ultimately comes into the whole concern on if people feel like they are being controlled or not. Because if you do feel you are being controlled, then you might be more acceptable to realizing a more anarchist style if you want to break free of your chains, so to speak. And one of the biggest ways of people necessarily feeling control or needing to realize that they maybe are being controlled is through the social contract. And that was another major point of the documentary, The Monopoly on Violence. The idea of a social contract could be seen through the eyes of any typical contract you go through in your life. When you would go to a car, you make a major purchase, and when you acquire that car, when you purchase that car, you have to sign many documents that acknowledge that you have read the rules of your car purchase. If it's a lease, if you're buying a car, whatever it might be, it's a contract of agreement. And this willingly you sign this document saying that you are now the given owner of that car. But the government does not give you an opportunity to do that through a social contract. Even when you are born, you're not necessarily forced to sign, or maybe when you become of age, such as 18, you are not given a paper that says you have to sign this document to say that you are a willing participant in the United States of America. And it is a very interesting idea. And even your parents don't necessarily have to sign a contract saying that you are a willing participant until you are of age or anything like that. And the documentary uses a really good example of this with doctors, and I don't want to necessarily spoil that example fully, because I do want you to watch this documentary and me not spoil everything in this analysis piece. But the long story of that whole example was the fact that you are able to perform a surgery, or to perform a CPR on someone that has passed out, knowing that they're most likely going to want to live another day, and you're able to do that without necessarily having to get a consent of that person who has passed out. But a surgeon cannot perform a surgery on someone that is conscious and it can make a decision. They can't just randomly put you down, give you a shot, and make you pass out and perform a surgery without asking you first if you are conscious. And it is a very big example of the different sort of effect that government has, and the idea that you should have a theory, or should have an idea of signing that you are a willing participant of the United States of America. And I do think that this is kind of best said by John as well.
The social contract idea it's just another kind of like form of rhetoric in order to increase control. I mean, that's what it is. It's trying to control your behaviors and your obviously mostly just your behaviors, but your thoughts as well, and what you're allowed to do, what's acceptable in society. But you being born again is not actually signing that contract, as people will suggest when they use that against you. They say, well, it's a social contract, so you have to. Most of the time, it's in a conversation about taxes, but yeah, it's like well, that's what the price you pay for living in a society and these sorts of things. Well, you didn't choose that when you were born. You didn't choose to be born. It's something that happened to you, Like
Well,
one of
you
the
can
few
choose-
things that
Idea becomes a more anarchist approach that you should have an option to be able to sign a document with people that you have an agreement with. In other words, there should be separate societies within the United States of America that you can sign a contract in and agree to be a part of their government because you believe what they believe more than you believe a mass government like exists today. Because once again, it is very hard to get people to agree on anything when it comes to the governmental system we have today. And it is very hard to kind of force opinions on something. It's kind of a similar analogy to try to put a circle in a square hole or put a triangle in a rectangle hole or whatever you want to use an analogy for, but you get the concept. And I do think that this is also best said by Ed.
And decide our own social construct based on where we live and the amount of governments that we want. If I want more government than what I currently have, I will move into an area that has more government, and I will either sign the social contract or just it'll be implied because I decided that I wanted to live in that place. Whereas if John wants to live with less government, then he'll move to a place that has no laws, no governance, and just basically someone there to sit there and represent him to the rest of the country and nothing else.
Question then becomes, is there an example in today's world where we see this happening? We will be answering that question after the education part, but before we start to answer the question, we do also need to understand the different types of living anarchism that we will also get to. But I think we should first start, before we dive into those issues, with the education part of the Monopoly on Violence documentary, because I do think if I had to pick just one part of the documentary that was the strongest, it was the education part, and first teaching us some history and then moving in to why education is bad in today's system. The documentary comes right off the gate within the first 10 minutes talking about education and the formation of education, and then later starts to talk about how education's role in today works and how it just kind of needs to be changed. But we're going to start off with the beginning portion of where Thaddeus Russell started laying out the history of education. And if you want to watch just one particular part of this documentary, I would highly suggest just watching this portion of the documentary if you only want to watch one, but really you should watch the whole thing. But anyway, he did an absolutely amazing job at laying out the history of education, and I'll try to do my best to sum it up as best as possible. But in other words, he was arguing the fact that the only reason education was formatted the way it is to create a assembly line effect where students go into education and get taught certain perspectives and certain ideas, and they then go out to the world and be more soldiers for the state so that they're able to control it. He also compared it to more of a low security type of prison where you are allowed to leave only at the end of the day if you promise that you will come back tomorrow, and you can't leave anywhere else in between because it is run similar to like a prison. But once again, I would highly suggest watching that part where he goes into much more detail at explaining it. But the documentary also talks and gives little warnings about how education is taught today. It argues over the fact of education and how important education is and why education is run by the state. In other words, it's hard to format one sort of education type of system that everybody goes into and learns something more off of. In other words, education is only formatted in such a way that what the state controls, what they teach you. So you're able to learn concepts, but you're not able to necessarily learn anything besides what they want you to learn. And sometimes some of those concepts aren't 100% true to that particular person, as well as the state controls most of the time these state schools. And unless if you're a somewhat rich or type of family, you're not allowed to put your kid in a private school that has a little less restrictions to what they are allowed to use. And a lot of times kids and students need different sort of type of school so that they can learn better information. I compare myself to me and my brother. I went to a small international private school and my brother went to a public school, and we both fit into those type of schools a lot better than if you tried to force everybody into one similar type of schooling system. So that is a very interesting idea of why we exactly do that. But another good point was brought up by Mark Thornton, where he explains that We are all taught to think, but more important, we're not taught to think about certain issues such as what caused the nation to fail. He argued it was because of reasons that are not necessarily taught in the schooling system that he thinks needs to be taught. So in other words, they argue to the point that education itself needs to be more diverse so that you get more people qualified in what they learn about education, as well as learning the right sort of information besides what just the state or the nation wants to teach your students. So this individualized approach to education does make a lot of sense because certain people and certain students have things they like to learn more or things they would be better at doing, such as a student who really likes business. So the idea that you would have an individualized schooling system for that student that likes business, give them more business classes, makes sense because that person wants to pursue that career. It could be a very good opportunity for him to do so. So it's a very interesting concept and a very interesting idea as far as education goes. And I do think if education were to be formatted that way, and maybe the state doesn't have to control everything that goes through the education system, there could be more educated students for the particular areas of interest they have, which does make a lot of sense. But there is a reason why education is done the way it is, and you could argue the exact reasons, but the documentary believes it's the reasons to more create soldier type of people instead of just trying to educate people for the mass amount of interest and things around that area. But that is just one very good point that the documentary made, but we're also going to now move into where living anarchy happens and examples where we can see anarchy happening now instead of just theorizing what could be. Law could be one of those examples where we see anarchy in our lives right now. International law being a legal system where every nation is created more as equals with no necessarily higher power. And this could be an active example of international law existing because every nation is seen as equal, yet laws and ideas are still being able to get passed for nations to agree upon. So the fact that something like this does exist is a promising example for the idea of anarchy, or at least an idea of changing the system of how it exists right now. And it's kind of the whole operating system that no one nation or no one person is in charge of the entire international law or put in charge of the international law system. And I think this is kind of best said by John here, where he explains that international law could be one of those examples.
I think that international law is somewhat representative of the idea of anarchy.
Somewhat, yeah, especially since there's very little they can do to enforce it. It kind of has to be voluntary enforcement.
A social contract, as it were?
Right, but one that you can sign. One that you can opt out of as well.
That being said, to play devil's advocate more on this issue, international law is not a perfect system or perfect example of what a potential anarchy system could be or work as, because there does allow for certain things to creep into the system and allow the system to not be a pure example of what someone would think of as a pure textbook definition of what anarchy would be or an anarchist system. And I do think this is best said by Anna Volt.
However, I would disagree in saying that international law is a solidification of anarchy. I would say it's actually a bit the opposite, because what we see internationally is that what governs is not treating countries as equals. What governs is power dynamics. You have the
are involved in a system like international law. Is there any example where this isn't necessarily the case? Because there is obviously going to be when you're talking about a nationwide system, nations are going to want to fight with each other and to have a power dynamic so that they are seen as the one in charge, or they are seen as a higher nation, or they are seen as a better nation, whatever, sort of verb you want to add in into that issue or that example you want to put for that issue. Power dynamics are going to be involved when you involve different nations and you're talking about a idea of an anarchist system at that large scale of nationwide, because I don't think that's ever necessarily going to happen when you're talking about a worldwide scale system, let alone a nationwide issue. But I do think you could have examples of individual states or individual places in a particular state, for example, that an anarchist system could happen. And I think you do see one of those examples with Sharon, Mexico, and an abolishment of political parties they were able to do. The idea about this is people are going to make a system that best fits their interest and what makes them the most comfortable with each other. So even if you take the most anarchist style approach, the idea that a lot of anarchists have is that the people are still going to want to work together and create a system that is better for themselves, that doesn't necessarily involve someone above them exactly telling them what to do. And I do think you can see this with the Sharon, Mexico example, where they were able to get past it from the Mexican Supreme Court to allow themselves to be an individual nation without political parties involved in their system, and they're able to control themselves just with the individualized people, and they are still able to do business with local businesses and local economy. And as of now, the nation, or the idea, is still existing and still happening right now, so it has not gone downhill or anything like that. They still look like it is going well for the Sharon, Mexico example. And some could argue and play the devil's advocate role that this is an international example, so you can't necessarily say that you're able to do the same system in the United States. But you can also play devil's advocate to that point and say all it takes is for people to have an uprise, or for people to realize, go somewhere and create something like this system on their own, because they share that common interest. The only example that can be shared between any sort of nation or example of this existing is the common interest goal. The only reason Tron Mexico exists is because these people all had a common interest in creating something like that, and they even got it passed through the Mexican Supreme Court to allow no political parties to enter in. So it's a rather interesting idea and a real clear example of what exactly is working now. But you can also see this with a more neat example of songs and media of anarchist type of approach. There was this anarchist song and idea through a metal song that was produced by the band Backyards, and the song was called Veracity, and they even had a lyric that says they have no desire to save you, referring to politicians, and this made the Billboard list for the top metal song not that long ago. So, and you could argue that, well, songs don't really do that much, but songs have caused people to change their ideas, or at least explore new ideas, through only music being the reason for people to do that, because music can be very influential. So all that said, I do think the best case for a more anarchist approach, or a more different approach to what exists now, is because people have clearly seen how divided the nation has become, either because of mass media, or because of politicians, or because of the president, if you're someone that is not a fan of President Trump. They have caused so much division between political parties and people who identify themselves on political parties, that the idea of ever meeting in the middle, again, is never going to come true, and a lot of people see that as happening, and a lot of people may be getting tired of it, as you can see with some more examples of people becoming more outspoken on their political beliefs. So something like a Tehran, Mexico could happen in the United States just because of people's desire to get rid of a system that they see now as bad. In summary of this whole thing, I think that The Monopoly on Violence is a very interesting documentary that you should watch, and if you have survived this whole length of the video and you're still watching now, you are probably going to want to watch The Monopoly of Violence if you haven't seen it, or if you have seen it, you probably, that's why you clicked on this video, so welcome if that is you. But the whole idea of The Monopoly on Violence was educating you for an anarchist style approach, or at least changing the style of approach, or changing your thought on how you see the government. And I do think the documentary was very effective on doing so, and I do think it was smart to clearly define the idea of anarchy in their documentary. I didn't cover each sort of documentary example they mentioned about anarchy and who formed it and their overall thoughts, because there was a very large portion on that, and I don't know too much history of the individual people they mentioned, so I didn't want to take time and explore that, because I didn't necessarily want to get something wrong. So I picked the parts that interested me and the parts I thought the documentary was the most strong at. But if you are confused by anything I mentioned when talking about anarchy and maybe not explaining it too well, you can definitely click on that section for the documentary where they explain that issue in particular, or the history of anarchy in particular. And if I were to say that this documentary was effective, I do think it was effective in at least educating the people that watched it, and definitely educating myself from when I watched it, because I didn't necessarily know of the ideas that were mentioned in it. And I do think that if you were to pick the strongest thing going towards this documentary, especially at the time of its release with the George Floyd death and whatnot, is the idea that people are getting mad at the government. And I think the overall people getting mad, and if they educate themselves, could lead to something like a Tehran, Mexico, like I was mentioning earlier. But I do think the strongest idea, and the idea that I take away the most with, which I don't know would be the most practical, is the idea of panarchy, just because our nation has become divided on two political ideologies. And I don't necessarily see so many individualized places forming like Tehran more than I see a simple split or the succession of a certain state more than anything else. But all of those are very extreme, and the only way they're necessarily going to happen is, one, if people educate themselves, then people get mad from educating themselves and want to dissolve themselves from the government, or the government simply imploding on itself. So unless if one of those things happen, I'm not particularly sure if the idea the documentary was mentioning or the solutions the documentary were given would happen. But they are very interesting. It's something that made me want to think and made me want to create this very long video when analyzing the monopoly on violence. So those who are involved in the monopoly on violence, or those who watched it or gave money to it, thank you very much, because this was a very good watch and very, very well done, and thank you for your effort in producing something like it. But make sure, if you watched all the way to the end, to subscribe, like, and comment, and do all that YouTube-y stuff. And if you watched all the way till now, I would highly appreciate it, but thank you.